Hey guys, it's Mitch. How's it going? We're taking a look today at one of the most exciting events of 1999. This is an event that kind of reinvigorated comics for a lot of people, I think. Because in 1999, Alan Moore released his ABC line of comics. And today we're looking at one of those opening day titles. We're looking at Top 10 Number 1. So we're just going to set the scene a little bit here. First, provide a little context. If you want to skip ahead of that, feel free. I've left chapters in the description so you can just jump to the comic if you want. So Alan Moore, I think, has managed to entrench himself as one of the biggest names in comic history. I think there are a lot of people who would classify him as the greatest writer in comics history, and I count myself among those. Apart from just how good his stories were, how elaborate and creative they could get, it was also kind of incredible how easily Alan Moore could slip from genre to genre, without really missing a beat, and in fact challenged himself as often as he could, to try and take on types of works that he'd never attempted before. Also, his output was kind of incredible. Alan Moore was ridiculously prolific. It's been noted in an interview, at least with Rob Liefeld, that when he was buying scripts off of Alan Moore, he would buy like 3 scripts a week. And it went like clockwork. Every single week, 3 brand new Alan Moore scripts. Of course, in the early 90s, people might have forgotten how prolific Alan Moore was because nobody was willing to pay him to work. At that point, he'd established himself as one of the most important creators of the 80s. Turning books like Swamp Thing from an also-ran into an award-winning must-read, turning the industry on its ear with the seminal Watchmen, still regarded as one of the best stories in comic history, and even knocking out one of the classic Batman stories with The Killing Joke. But, often when you get creative types working with corporate types, fireworks kind of tend to fly. And after DC screwed over Alan Moore in regards to ownership of the Watchmen characters and properties, Alan Moore swore to never work for them again. And for good measure, it seemed he wasn't willing to work for Marvel either, just didn't want anything to do with any kind of corporate comic book company. And for the next few years, he kind of labored in obscurity. I mean, he created, again, some incredible work with stuff like Big Numbers and what could be argued as his masterpiece in From Hell. The only difficulty was those were done with much smaller publishers and could be kind of difficult to find. So from like 1988 to 1993, a comic reader could be forgiven in thinking that Alan Moore had just kind of stopped making comics unless they really looked. But in 1993, he came back with some weird shit, as him and Rick Veitch and Steve Bissette released 1963, which was a throwback to Silver Age Marvel titles for the most part. And after that project got kind of truncated, he moved on to doing some work for hire for like Todd McFarlane on Spawn and Violator, and then Rob Liefeld on fucking Badrock vs. Violator. He also managed what turned out to be a pretty good run on Jim Lee's Wildcats. The only thing was that all these comics kind of seemed like fluff. It's like, these are weird things for Alan Moore to be writing in the 90s after you've established yourself as one of the most talented creative forces. Then in 1996, things started to shift a little bit as Alan Moore, I'm still working with Rob Liefeld, turned his sights to Liefeld's character Supreme, which was kind of like a lot of Liefeld projects in that it was a half-hearted attempt to sort of riff on an existing property. The basic concept wasn't too complicated, it was just what if Superman was a dick? And Alan Moore got offered that property, and the question he asked was, well, what if he wasn't? What if he was just Superman? Because I get the idea that Alan Moore had grown up with quite a bit of fondness for the Silver Age Kurt Swan Superman stories. Alan Moore had written one of the definitive Superman stories with Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, and you get the impression that a guy like Alan Moore probably couldn't help himself with just coming up with new ideas that would have worked in that kind of Silver Age setting. There were echoes of what he was doing on 1963 before that, but I'm pretty sure there was more to it than that. In the 80s, Alan Moore had been instrumental in turning comics down a more gritty and cynical avenue. And by 1996, that had kind of reached an apex, to the point where most mainstream comics, I would say, weren't really suitable for young kids. I'm talking like 6 or 7 or 8 years old, which, is kind of the age you want to be starting to indoctrinate those kids. Get them hooked early. And from what I understand, Alan Moore felt some measure of responsibility for that. So I think he decided he was the one who had to go out and fix it. And Supreme was his starting point. Taking Rob Liefeld's dumb, smashy, very 90s asshole Superman, and changing him into the Superman of the 60s and 70s, who was compassionate, who was scientific, and who went on crazy and fantastical adventures. That book sometimes had some dark corners, but for the most part it was a return to a much more optimistic time in comics. And the Supreme series did well, critically at least. It did win awards. I think it won an Eagle Award. The difficulty, of course, though, was that it wasn't selling. One of the big problems was that the established audience for Liefeld books, if they were going to buy an extreme book, they wanted that big, dumb, smashy action. Alan Moore's clever, optimistic little book about a bunch of super friends going on adventures, like the audience hadn't been cultivated for that book. It was a problem with the brand versus the concept. Cut to 1998, Alan Moore is still working with Rob Liefeld because Rob Liefeld keeps paying those bills. And on the table was a complete rebrand of Rob Liefeld's entire line of books, where Alan Moore was going to get to kind of turn everything into a direction that he thought it should go in. Some of it even managed to get a foot out the door. There's a couple of issues printed of Alan Moore's version of Glory, which was kind of rooted in Wonder Woman, but was taking it in a completely different direction. Of course, it all became kind of a moot point when Rob Liefeld's current company at the time, Awesome Entertainment, went under when one of their main backers pulled out, which left Alan Moore with the kernels of a whole bunch of concepts and nowhere to publish them. So he did the smart thing and cut loose from the guy who was paying his bills but had a history of being erratic, and instead took those concepts to a guy who was much more steady and business-minded in Jim Lee. And Alan Moore was able to negotiate an entirely new line with Jim Lee, based in the kernels of what he had already started to work out when he was getting paid by Rob Liefeld. So in early 1999, production on these titles was well underway. All the creative teams were in place. And Alan Moore was getting ready to turn comics on its ear once again, with a whole new line of comics that got away from the grim and gritty thing and turned comics back to its roots. So we're talking getting back to the pulps, getting back to mythology, getting back to literature. And things were just about good to go when a bomb kind of dropped in his lap as Jim Lee announced that he had sold Wildstorm to DC, which left Alan Moore in kind of a quandary because he had sworn to never work for DC again, way back in the day when DC screwed him out of ownership of the Watchmen property. And if it had still been the early days in the development of the line, where it was really just Alan Moore working out concepts, I think at that point he would have walked away and figured out something else. But by this point, like I said, creative teams were in place, and there were all sorts of people who were doing all sorts of work and depended on the pending paycheck that was attached to these books. So Alan Moore kind of had to swallow his pride and resign himself to the fact that all of his checks going forward were going to say DC on them. So a little bit deflating when he was about to put out his big launch, but it did ensure the launch went through and it was a massive success, announcing Alan Moore's return to the big stage in comics. So that brings us to this comic here. That's enough grandstanding. So here we are with Top 10 number 1, one of the premier titles of the ABC line. Not one of the ones I think that got the most attention in that line. It feels like the stars of the show were Tom Strong and Promethea, and maybe even League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, a bit more than this. And those ones, like I said before, those were getting back to the roots of comic books. Tom Strong was an homage on pulp stories in a Doc Savage kind of vein. Promethea was getting back to mythology, as well as the early days of comics with stuff like Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel. And League of Extraordinary Gentlemen had maybe the most intriguing idea for a superhero type of comic book, at least to me anyway, in that it was a superhero team that was comprised of literary characters. Even Tomorrow Stories, again, got back to the pulp roots, except for maybe the Splash Brannigan stuff, which seemed to get back to like Harvey Kurtzman era Mad Magazine, maybe? I'm not for sure. I didn't read a whole lot of Splash Brannigan. But Top 10 is a little bit different. Top 10 is superhero book as police procedural, based on popular TV shows like Hill Street Blues and NYPD Blue. So that homaged a lot of the tropes in those kind of shows, as well as being the most Easter egg-laden comic for comic book readers. So let's get into it. We can start with the cover. Each of Top 10, Tom Strong and Promethea came out with 2 variant covers, one by the in-house artist on the book and another by Alex Ross, who had reached kind of the zenith of his popularity and hadn't yet oversaturated the market with painted variant covers. So it was still a big deal to get a number 1 with an Alex Ross painted cover. And we're going to get all of our characters leaping into action in kind of a classic Alex Ross type of cover. It's a very good one as far as that goes. Like, everybody looks pretty much perfect. We'll get into the characters as we get into the book. So we're going to start things off on a subway somewhere in a city. That's about all we know off the hop. This is Monday, October 5th, 1999, her first day at the new job. And we're going to assume that the her in question is this character here because she's centralized in the panel and she's the only one who remains unchanged from panel to panel. And we're going to get our first taste of what the flavor of this book is. in that it's very grounded and kind of mundane, at least to start with. It's just a bunch of people on a subway having mundane conversations. Get some teenager over here talking to somebody saying like every third word. Get somebody else on a cell phone here who's trying to coordinate with his wife. And they get to the stop here, all the ordinary passengers get off. And then as we proceed, a whole bunch of dudes in colorful costumes get on, and they're having the same kind of mundane conversations. You get a couple here in like capes with jetpacks and shit, and they're talking about a local sports team. Get another father-daughter combo, only again in costume. And the daughter is bugging the dad about getting a more fashionable costume. And the dad's like, I don't know, you're kind of young to be getting the kind of costumes that teenagers wear these days. And our central figure here doesn't change very much. She shifts a little bit from panel to panel, but she remains mostly unfazed by the change. So this is just how things go day to day. And then, we flip the page, and this is where she's headed. This is Neapolis. This is a city that is populated pretty much entirely by superheroes. Every single person is in costume. We're going to see superpowered hot dog vendors, superpowered businessmen, superpowered homeless people. Gang members, doctors, meter maids, and of course policemen all have superpowers. And in a world like that, of course, superpowers become a day-to-day occurrence, so they become part of the mundane background. And you grasp that pretty quick, because, the setup here, it's not the most engaging first page exactly, but it does a good job in situating you in the context of the book. By the time we get here, you already kind of grasp it a little. So this, of course, is going to be written by Alan Moore. Art on this is going to be handled by Gene Ha and Xander Cannon, with Todd Klein doing the letters and Wildstorm Effects doing the colors. Thankfully, the colors don't go too overboard in this. This is the time of digital color just going too far, trying too hard to put effects into everything. It feels like there was a directive to kind of scale things back a little bit. Gene Ha and Xander Cannon are really important in this. For one thing, Gene Ha, the penciler, you can kind of see what he's bringing to the table in that he's doing a shit ton of detail. Apparently, when he heard that Alan Moore was working on launching a new line, Gene Ha was still pretty young at this time, and he was still pretty new in comics. He'd gotten a fair bit of work under his belt, but he hadn't really established himself as an industry regular just yet. So when he heard about the new line that Alan Moore was putting out, he got in touch with the only mutual acquaintance he knew between him and Alan Moore, which was Alex Ross. And he let Alex Ross know that he would do just about anything to get work on an Alan Moore project. And Alex Ross's advice was basically, okay, then shoot your shot. So he did. He got together a portfolio, sent it off to Alan Moore, and Alan Moore approved him as a potential artist who could carry out a particular kind of vision. And when he did get approved for a book, he got the word. He was like, I was okay with any of them as long as it wasn't top 10. Because he didn't want to have to draw all these meticulous backgrounds. Prometheus sounded like a lot of fun. Top 10, not so much. So he got the word, and it's like, was it Promethea? And he's like, no, it's top 10. And he was like, oh shit, okay. Whatever, it's Alan Moore, I got him in. And he got to work designing characters and backgrounds and all that shit. And he got a long lead-up time. I can't imagine, it was enough for how much detail he's packing into all these pages here. This is ridiculous. But I guess it must have been, because those first 6 issues did come out on a monthly schedule. The schedule kind of breaks down after that. But I think that's excusable, because, every time one did come out, it did still have the same attention to detail and the same kind of level of quality that had already been established. So we should explain the plot, at least, about what's going on here. This is Robin Slinger, and she's on her way to her first day at the local precinct. This is Precinct 10. On her way, she takes a cab over. Her cabbie, of course, is also super-powered. This is Bob Blindshot Booker. He's blindfolded, but he uses Zen powers to navigate. So he basically just kind of goes where the universe wants him to. And of course, the first thing he does when he pulls out is nearly gets in an accident with someone driving a high-tech, hover scooter here. And then again, almost gets in multiple accidents on his way as he speeds down the road. Of course, he's got to be in a dragster too, right? And Top 10, I think, would become known for having all sorts of Easter eggs in the background. There's not a whole lot in this first issue. They become a bit more prolific as the series went on. There are a couple, though. For instance, we get a superpowered Elvis in the background by the looks of it. Also, the truck he cuts off here is for Fly Straight Dry Cleaning, whose motto is Fly Straight, Look Great. So again, kind of establishing that everybody in this world has crazy powers, and it's all run-of-the-mill. And Gene Ha reinforces it on every page here. With the level of detail, and the amount of ink that he spreads over everything, it makes everything look very grimy. But also with the characters themselves, they look very realistic a lot of the time. And most of them aren't designed to look like particularly attractive people. They're just kind of everyday schmoes. A lot of them, their costumes aren't particularly flattering, you know? And on the page turn here, we arrive at Precinct 10, which is a pretty beautifully designed building here. Like, for a guy who didn't want to draw backgrounds very much, Gene Ha came up with some really nice looking ones. The first 12 pages in this comic are actually particularly impressive because these were done before a solid creative team was established, and he didn't even have an inker to work with just yet. So Gene Ha is doing both pencils and inks on these first 12 pages. From page 13 and on, Xander Cannon came in, and Xander Cannon would actually become like one of the creative partners on the book. You know, for one thing, obviously it freed Gene Ha up quite a bit when he didn't have to meticulously ink everything he'd put on these pages. He left it up to Xander Cannon to meticulously ink all that. But in addition, while working together, they kind of came to the realization that they worked very well as a team, where a lot of the aspects that Gene Ha had difficulty with, which is stuff like page layouts, Xander Cannon was actually quite good at. So, you know, Gene Ha had some difficulty with translating the very involved scripts that he would get from Alan Moore onto them. But once he got rolling with Xander Cannon, Cannon started acting as like an intermediary between the two, where he could turn Alan Moore scripts into more readable thumbnails that Gene could work from. So basically a language that Gene was more fluent in. So anyway, as I said, Robin arrives at the precinct, and now we're going to start getting slowly introduced to all of our supporting characters. We meet first Jack Phantom, and she's going to kind of guide us into the precinct proper, where we meet the Dust Devil and Lieutenant Peregrine. She doesn't feature in this very much, but she will more so as the series progresses. Part of the pace of this book was down to Alan Moore kind of coming to terms with writing a team book, which is something he hadn't done a whole lot of before this. They pop in quickly to the captain's office, which is Captain Jetman, along with the Lieutenant, Kamlo Caesar, who's just like a talking dog character. He's got like this exoskeleton on with just like regular people clothes, so he does look like a dude with a dog head, but we're going to find out later on in the series, like, no, he's just a dog. In a high-tech outfit, but very much just a dog. And the dialogue, again, it's all mundane, it's also all familiar. If you were watching those police procedurals in the 90s, like if you swapped out the more superhero aspects in this could be a script from any one of those shows. You know, this is kind of a standard walk and talk sequence that probably would have been filmed with like, you know, a handheld camera as we follow our main characters along, but we also get a sense of the environment that they're moving through and all the events going on around them. Which I can't imagine was particularly easy to script, you know, particularly if Alan Moore wasn't all that familiar with team books at that time. But you wouldn't know it because it all flows very well. So anyway, Robin here is going to follow Kamlo into the briefing room, where Kamlo is going to give the officers their marching orders for the day, and it's an opportunity to meet more of these characters that we've been catching glimpses of throughout the precinct. You know, we briefly meet Dwayne Bodine, the Dust Devil, who's like kind of a high-tech cowboy. We meet Shock-Headed Peter, who's a racist prick with electro powers. Doesn't really seem to have any problem with any kind of people. It's robots that he's racist towards. And we also meet Armageddon, who's a middle-aged breadwinning wife with 2 kids. She's also a walking arsenal. And last but not least, we get kind of a glimpse of the guy who's going to be Robin's new partner, and this is Jeff Smacks. Smacks is like a 10-foot blue giant who's invulnerable and can shoot like a force beam out of his chest. He's also a world-weary prick who doesn't appreciate being saddled with the bright-eyed newbie. So again, we're playing on those police procedural tropes. So this is Sipowicz, essentially, the Dennis Franz character from NYPD Blue. And Robin herself is the classic fish-out-of-water character who acts as the audience's window into this fantastical world. You know, we're following her around, and all this stuff is new to her, so, you know, she reacts with, you know, wonder and surprise sometimes, and it mirrors our reaction, so naturally we relate to her more. It also helps with things like background and plot, because, you know, Robin is the newbie. She needs to have things explained to her so she can know what to do. We also need to have these things explained to her so that we know the things that are being done and why they're being done. So Smacks is taking his new partner out on their assigned role for the day. And they started in the garage with a pretty sweet sci-fi cruiser here. I tell you, man, Gene Ha did not skimp when it came to the designs on this book. You know, the characters are all intricate and very easily defined from each other, but also the backgrounds, like all the kind of neo-futuristic designs going into both the vehicles and the buildings, and at the same time managing to ground them in reality. Again, like throwing those grimy textures when it's appropriate. You know, like here, this looks like brushstroke stuff. And managing to always keep things looking like they're in proper proportion. Like, this is an insane amount of skill, really, for a guy, like I said, who hasn't been working in the comics industry all that long and is still kind of young. So Robin and Smacks are on their way to respond to a domestic disturbance call. On the way, Robin's going to try and make small talk with Smax. Smax is going to shut her down at every turn. And when he gets short with her, she kind of loses her cool for a second, says, "What did your last partner die of? They drowned in charm or something?" And he kind of bluntly goes, "Nope, he got shot through the eye in his own apartment. His 8-year-old daughter found him when she got home from school." So, like I said, there are some nasty elements sometimes in this universe. This book, I would say, more so than the others. But this one is based in a more gritty kind of source, as it's based in those police procedural shows. So they get to the destination. Smax is just too big to be allowed, essentially. He, just kind of climbed up the stairs here, and it feels like he has difficulty fitting in the stairwell properly. And they get to the door they're looking for, ask him to open up, and whoever's inside essentially tells him to fuck off. So Smax knocks the door down with that power blast from his chest. It's a pretty impressive looking shot here. Good angle, too. Popping him out of the panel border, which, of course, helps to highlight the character, but also accentuates just how big Smax is again. And they get in the apartment, and, of course, the couple that were quarreling, it's a superpowered couple. The husband is like a Mr. Fantastic kind of guy. The wife can turn into sand. When she was younger, she went by the name Beach Bunny. And, these days they're both getting older. And you get the feeling that the husband here, Dr. Incredible, is maybe starting to kind of lose connection with reality a little bit. Like it might be a little bit of dementia. Because he's accusing her of making eyes at some supervillain. And she's like, "That was 30 years ago. He's in a home now." Smax grabs a handful of them and just kind of pulls them out into the hall here. And he's going to have a little chat. I don't think the wife is going to press charges. And he's going to promise to go back to counseling. And again, it's all very kind of run-of-the-mill. Which is good, It's just kind of it's not even a case. It's just kind of a smaller incident that gives you context for the world. And it's the kind of thing you can build off with bigger actual cases. So when Robin and Smax get back to the car, they're getting a call. And they're being asked to aid a couple of other officers. So this is Synesthesia and King Peacock. Synesthesia is synesthetic, which is a thing, maybe. Her deal is basically she perceives things differently. So, sounds might appear to her as colors or taste or some kind of feel, etc. Same with all of her other senses. King Peacock's thing is that he talks to the devil. It is a religion for him. Basically, as far as his religion is concerned, God abandoned the universe and the devil took over. So he's in communication with the devil, and that grants him, Karnak-like abilities, where he can discover, weak points in things. So Sin and John, that's King Peacock, his name is John, are at their assignment, which is to check out a body that was found. Robin and Smax show up, and Sin and John notice that Robin's a little bit awkward around Jeff. So, they're going to try and make her feel a little bit welcome by yelling, "Hey, fresh meat, get your ass over here." And they're just playing, they just want to get her away from Smax for a second. They know his rep. They know he's probably not been treating her particularly well, really. So since she's on site, might as well try to help with the investigation. They're going to try and flip the body, but that proves to be a little bit difficult as, every bone in his body has shattered. So there's not much to look at with the body. They're just going to have to search the lot to see if they can find anything, which Robin can help with because this is her deal, is that she's got all these mechanical toys that respond to her command. These were all built by her dad, who was like a 60s superhero. And she gets them all to fan out and search the area, which makes things a whole lot simpler. And they're able to find his ID pretty quick. This is Stefan Grachik, goes by the name of Saddles. And they find a matchbook with a phone number. That's always convenient when that happens. And yeah, these are great looking pages. There's still a ton of detail on everything. This is page 12 here. So this is the last page that Gene Ha would have penciled and inked himself. And this is where Xander Cannon picks up. And you can kind of see it opening up a little bit. Although the detail is going to get a little bit intense again from time to time. Like that kind of thing. So now they know who the guy is, and they find his high-powered flying saddle, which explains the name. So they've got at least something to go on. They're going to head back to the precinct. When they get back, they find Dwayne and Pete, who had been on their own assignment to go and round up prostitutes in the neighborhood, because something called the Lieber Killer might be on the prowl again. So this is a serial killer that seems to get active once every, 23 years. And it usually goes after prostitutes, and that time of the century is rolling around again. So they're just rounding them up for their own safety. And, everybody's just kind of getting on with their day. They're all bitching and just, trying to move things along. Everybody's in this fantastical world. They're all wearing ridiculous clothing, but it's just acting like this is everyday business. So while they're checking her in, another couple of cops come back. This is Armageddon, of course, and Girl 1, who had been sent out to look into some gang activity. And they've come back with an 8-foot-tall kaiju kid. Just a little guy. This is Ernesto Gogra, who is the son of a much larger Gogra. One of the great things about this comic is that there's so much that gets set up in this first issue that gets paid off later on. Like everything we've seen so far, really. Like Gogra's kid, like the Libra killer with the prostitutes. They even mentioned something called the Ghostly Goose, which is just some invisible force that seems to grope women. And that's going to keep coming back. Each of the characters, I think, has their own like mini storyline at some point during the series. And of course, there's going to be the main thing, which is the murder of Stefan Gracic. So on that one in particular, when Robin goes to the cafeteria to go get some lunch, Irma and Girl One join her, but Caesar comes up quickly and says, "We got a break on the dead guy from Tin Town, so go check that out." So anyway, turns out Saddles was a drug runner, and of course this is a superpowered world, so the drugs are superpowered as well. As I say, it's exotic stuff: Amazo pills, mongoose blood, hyperdrine. We get a quick glimpse of the captain briefing the commissioner, Commissioner Ultima, who, of course, will come back later in the series. At this point, he's just letting her know what the current state of their investigation is. And she kind of like gives him some reasonably light pushback. Just, we don't have an unlimited budget. I've got a lot of precincts I got to look after. As the series goes on, that pushback gets to be more and more noticeable. But anyway, the captain finishes his call with the commissioner, and he's going to break it down that obviously the only lead they've got is the phone number that was on that matchbook. But they have been able to trace that to a drug factory manufacturing outlawed super pills and potions in the Lanchester district. So he's issued a warrant for a raid, and Precinct 10 is going to go down to that warehouse in force. So they're all going to load up in their cruisers and head out, and we get a little bit of radio going on with a song that Alan Moore wrote lyrics for that has, like, superhero lyrics, because that's just something Alan Moore seems to like to do. I think the most memorable example is when he was coming up with songs in V for Vendetta. He did that multiple times there. But he also did that in Neonomicon. I'm sure it's happened several times since then as well. So they arrive at the warehouse, and yeah, we're going to get a raid. We're going to get an action sequence. Sin and King Peacock are taking point on this one. This is their bust. So they're going to lead the charge. King Peacock's going to dive in first. He's a couple of, I don't know, workers or something like that, gang members. And we get to see him in action as he flips over like this robot here and pulls its head clean off because he's got that thing where he can discover the weak points pretty easily. So while they're going in the front, Girl One and Robin are going to break in the back, where there's another couple of gang members. Girl One can handle them easily. And again, it's good to see them actually using their powers. There's a lot of characters in this, so you don't get to see, sustained use of powers. It's just a little bit for everybody, really. And some people you don't exactly need to, like Armageddon, for example. You kind of get the gist. You don't, as soon as you see her outfit covered in, fucking warheads and everything, you don't exactly need to see them going off to get, the idea of what she's about. So while she's taking out the gang members here, one of them's yelling, "Stop him, don't let him reach the professor before he's through." So Girl One yells at Robin, "Go get down to the basement and figure out what he's talking about." She gets down there and finds some old guy who's hucking stuff into a furnace, and she sticks her toys on him. He is able to melt one of them, which she seems to take kind of personally, but she is able to incapacitate him. And it turns out this is actually a famous evil scientist from, I'm not even sure, the 30s or 40s, something like that. This is Grigory Gromolko. And when Girl One comes down and sees who she's caught, it's kind of a big deal. This is her first day, and she's caught this super famous villain. They also, of course, find all sorts of drugs there, which they're able to bring back to the precinct, so this raid has been completely successful. Sin isn't completely happy, though, because she was at the murder site for Saddles. She was hearing, like faint Beethoven music. And she was kind of hoping to hear that here, because, there's a connection and everything, but she didn't pick anything up. And with the synesthesia stuff, that could mean anything. It could be linked to a sound. It could also be linked to some kind of texture, or a taste, or a smell. Who knows at this point? But Alan Moore is going to bring it up again just to make sure that you didn't miss it the first time. So they bring Gromolko inside the precinct. They're going to take him straight to interrogation. Caesar congratulates Robin on, she's the one who gets the credit for the collar. But they don't get to celebrate too long because the prostitutes that were brought in earlier, their madam shows up to pay their bail. This is Large Marge, who is a giantess, and she's not going to leave until she's got her girls with her. And, Dwayne's here too, and he's going to follow the girls to the interrogation room. We're going to take a look at Gromolko because he doesn't want to stick around here since he was the one who brought, Large Marge's girls in. This hall is pretty great. We're not going to see very much of it again in this first issue. We can see little bits like the fact that there's a giant mural up that kind of encircles the central chamber, and it's all done in kind of a Jack Kirby style. And these are like the founders of Precinct 10, I think. Again, all sorts of little Easter eggs. Apparently, the layouts for the precinct got to be kind of, not exactly a point of contention, just a point maybe of frustration for Xander Cannon. Because, like, Alan Moore wasn't keeping track of the layout of the place. He's just writing scripts and he's just, like, freewheeling it. Gene Ha's just going off of what he gets from the scripts. Again, he doesn't particularly care. Xander Cannon cared, though. And he was coming up with, like, blueprints for the place to make sure everything made sense. Or, made sense as often as possible. Anyway, there is the odd time, I guess, where a room is somewhere it just shouldn't be. And he had to just kind of grit his teeth and, like, push through it. So now we're going to move into the interrogation chamber where Gromolko sits. He's already got his lawyer with him. This is Mr. Fishman, who is, of course, an actual shark-headed lawyer. That character design was also by Xander Cannon. And Fishman is very much a Saul Goodman type of lawyer. So, naturally he brings up his client's rights, but nobody's asking him any questions just yet. They're waiting for the special interrogator to get there. Like, who's the special interrogator? And then he walks in. So this is Alexei Glushko, the spaceman, who is a Russian cosmonaut with telepathic powers. And Dr. Gromolko has been, like, chuckling this whole time. Like, every time he gets a line of dialogue, he ends it with a heh. Because he's an evil scientist. That's how they talk. He's not chuckling anymore, though, because, you bring in a telepath all of a sudden. It doesn't matter what kind of front you're going to put up. He's going to find out whatever he wants to find out. And he's muttering at his lawyer, being like, this is no good, get me out of here. Alexei starts rooting around in his head, and he's basically like, it's like he's reading files. Being like, Gratchik deserved it, double-crossing bastard. What does that mean, I wonder? And Gromolko is like panicked, and he's looking around, and he spots Dwayne standing right behind him. The only reason Dwayne was down there, again, was to avoid Large Marge. And he had a bit of a history with Dr. Gromolko. So there's, you can do some patter there. But Dwayne isn't entirely paying attention right now, and he doesn't notice that Gromolko's eyeing his 12-shooter. And all of a sudden he dives, makes a grab for the gun, and blows his own brains out. Which is a pretty big moment now that we're getting near the end of the book here. Everybody's all shook up after that, naturally. Dwayne, because, he should have been looking after his guns better, theoretically. Glushko, because he was inside of Gromolko's head when he went out. And the lawyer's just beside himself because, like, where's he going to get paid from now? And, they're going to try and sort it out, but there's not really much that Robin can do at the moment. Her shift is kind of ending, so they're going to kind of, you can go home, we'll take care of this. So she's like, okay, and she kind of wanders away. On her way out, she runs into Jack Phantom again. At the beginning, when, Jack Phantom was showing her around, she kind of offhandedly went, hey, I'll meet you for a beer after work. So now their shifts are over, she's going to hold her to that. And they head out of the precinct and down to the local bar, where Jack Phantom's going to make a pass at Robin, which kind of puts Robin on edge. She's not entirely sure how to deal with that. There's a bit of that in this comic, and it's kind of important to remember it wasn't really all that common at the time. We weren't too far out from North Star coming out of the closet by fighting a supervillain yelling, I am gay. That was the level of subtlety we were dealing with. So for it to just be, presented and then not made a really big deal of, and, Robin's uncomfortable for a second, and, Jack notices, obviously, and she's like, well, you can't blame me for trying. And that's it. It's not going to get brought up again. So, like I said, to be just kind of put out there and not made a big deal of, that in itself is kind of a big deal. And we're going to end with Robin returning home where her dad is sitting up watching TV and he's completely unresponsive. She says, hi, I'm home, and doesn't say anything. She's like, oh, how's my day been? Oh, arrested Professor Gromolko, but he shot himself. The other guys are mostly dogs, lesbians, and devil worshippers. They seem okay. Oh, and one of the Hueys got melted. And, she kind of gives him a kiss goodnight because, again, he doesn't respond. Although his expression does seem to soften a little bit when she, just kisses the top of his head. So he's just, he's not really in a state where he can be present, it seems like. He completely relies on Robin for survival. So now we know a little bit more about her personal life. And that's where things are going to end. And then we get a little bit about the history of Precinct 10 here. I think this is told from the perspective of Jetman. I didn't read it because that type's a little bit tough these days, even with the glasses. All right, a few ads. So yeah, that's going to do it for Top 10 number 1. So I liked this quite a bit when it first came out. I bought every issue of it. And it does keep building over its 12-issue run. It's like a season of a TV show. There's a lot of setup and payoff. Everything kind of fits together. We take little detours here and there to go explore little corners of this weird world. And sometimes it ties even further into the story, sometimes not, but, the side mission is still important on its own. And it still holds up really well today. It helps a lot that the quality of the art holds up over the entire series. I feel like every book in the ABC line at some point or another experienced delays because Alan Moore tended to get artists who tended to take a little time on the page. Guys like J.H. Williams on Promethea, he put a ton of detail on his pages as well. Chris Sprouse on Tom Strong, not so much, but I imagine that he spent a lot of time laying out his pages. That is actually one of the things I remember most about this line, is after a year or so, maybe like a year and a half, all of the books were delayed pretty much. You could usually rely on 1 or 2 hitting the shelves every month, but it was pretty rare you were going to get 3 or 4. As for the comic itself, it did okay. Sales on it kind of followed the pattern for all of the ABC books, which is that the first issue came out as like the 25th most ordered book for its month. None of these cracked the top 10. So it was like 50,000 copies for issue 1, and then it quickly kind of dropped down to 30, 35,000, then in the 20s. This is 99, this is post-speculator bubble. It was pretty tough to go cracking 100,000 copies sold anymore. Looks like only 2 comics managed it the month this came out. It would have been Uncanny X-Men and X-Men. Surprise, surprise. The comic itself also seemed to have a bit of an impact, particularly on Gene Ha and Xander Cannon. I think this is one of the things that they're most proud of having worked on. Like, there were sequels to this. There was a Jeff Smacks miniseries, which got a little weird, just a little bit. There was the 49ers, which went back to when Jetman was a kid sidekick. He was Jet Lad. And there was Top 10 Season 2. And Alan Moore wasn't involved in that one. That, as far as I can tell, was written mostly by Xander Cannon, with Gene Ha again providing the artwork. Which, I guess he could totally do, because he's a co-creator on this, so he has part ownership. Just even without having to go and get permission from Alan Moore. So that's an interesting little thing, and they seem to be very pleased to go back and revisit it. Because I imagine this was probably kind of a big event for their lives. This was their first big break, and they kind of made the most of it. So yeah, anyway, let me know in the comments what you thought about Top 10 when it came out, what you think about it today. I think it's still a great story that holds up extremely well, and again, gets very complicated. And it all kind of gets paid off in a really satisfying way. It's a really well-done book. I think we'll go through a few more of these ABC books pretty soon. I've got the number 1s for Promethea and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. We might as well. They're all quite good. So we'll have that to look forward to. But for this one anyway, that is going to do it. So thanks very much for watching, guys. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. If you're watching on mobile, you can always hit the hype button. And you should be seeing the link to take you to my Patreon there. You can check that out if you like as well. But yeah, that's going to do it. Thanks again for watching, guys. I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.